The Rockefeller family is one of America's most prominent dynasties, synonymous with wealth, philanthropy, and influence. Their fortune was primarily built by John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, who founded Standard Oil Company, creating a vast oil empire that made him the world's first billionaire. Across 7 generations, the Rockefellers have shaped industries, politics, and philanthropy, with notable figures like Nelson Rockefeller, New York Governor and U.S. Vice President, and institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation. Their wealth, estimated at $10 to $11 billion today, is preserved through Dynasty Trust, while their legacy includes cultural landmarks like Rockefeller Center and the Museum of Modern Art. Despite their contributions, the family's history is marked by controversies and persistent conspiracy theories. William Avery Rockefeller, often called Devil Bill by those who knew him, has long occupied a shadowy space in the annals of American history, thanks in large part to his son, John D. Rockefeller, rising to unimaginable wealth and influence. Digging into Devil Bill's life can feel like rummaging through old trunks in a dusty attic. Bits of scandalous rumor, half-remembered stories, uncertain documents, and contradictory accounts pop up everywhere. And yet it's undeniable that he influenced his famous son in subtle ways, even as John D. Rockefeller sought to bury any mention of his father's more outrageous deeds. One of the best-known snapshots of William Avery Rockefeller comes from a variety of later biographies and articles that set out to chart the Rockefeller family tree. In Ron Chernow's Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr., for instance, William is described as a traveling confidence man, someone who could spin elaborate tales and slip away before anyone realized they had been cheated. Contemporary references, as well as a host of blogs and lesser-known genealogical sources, mention that he often used the alias Dr. Bill Livingston, sometimes spelled Livingstone, hawking herbal cures and magical elixirs to unsuspecting townsfolk as he roamed around various parts of New York and the Midwest. The 19th century was a hotbed for traveling salesmen peddling patent medicines and miracle potions, sometimes called snake oil salesmen in the vernacular. These potions often promised to cure everything from rheumatism to baldness, and William fit right into this hustling environment. He could charm an audience with ease, extolling the virtues of his latest concoction, collecting cash, then departing swiftly if authorities started to poke their noses in. But if selling doubtful medical cures was the limit of William's misdeeds, he might have been seen as simply a product of his era. According to articles scanned from the New York Times archives and reprinted in various academic blogs, the 19th century's relative lack of federal regulation for medical or pharmaceutical practices made it easy for charismatic individuals to thrive on quackery. However, William Avery Rockefeller's story didn't end there. He was frequently accused of far darker acts, bigamy, and in at least one instance, outright rape. Evidence for these allegations appears in scattered sources, including Gary Allen's The Rockefeller File, first published in the 1970s. While the Rockefeller File itself is considered controversial, some of its broader claims about conspiracies lack definitive documentation. It references local rumors and partial court records that alleged William faced an indictment for rape around 1849 in a region of New York State known as Cayuga County. Did a local court issue a warrant for his arrest? Some references say yes, though verifying this with primary documents has proven difficult, as records can be missing or incomplete. Skeptics argue that people like Gary Allen drew heavily from hearsay and unsubstantiated gossip, repeating what had become local legend without ironclad proof. Still, The consistent rumor holds that William was often on the move precisely to avoid arrest, or even a vigilant citizenry that might have sought their own brand of frontier justice. Regardless of the ultimate truth behind the allegations, the notion that Devil Bill was hiding from the law found enough traction in multiple historical accounts that it shapes how we see him today, as a rogue figure who stayed one step ahead of accountability. The bigamy accusations, on the other hand, are more thoroughly documented. William officially married Eliza Davison, John D. Rockefeller's mother, in 1837. Eliza, typically described as devout and long-suffering, is said to have endured William's frequent absences and questionable moral behavior with quiet stoicism. Then in the early 1850s, William apparently took a second wife, Margaret Allen, while still married to Eliza. During this period, using an alias or traveling name was not uncommon for men looking to evade local laws or moral scrutiny. Margaret may have believed he was unmarried, or she might have been complicit in the ruse. Historians differ on this point. In any case, he lived a double life for several years. Sources such as the genealogical records of the Rockefeller family indicate that this second marriage produced children too, making the tangled web even more complex. What was Devil Bill like on a personal level? Various writings describe him as tall, striking, and unusually charismatic. Some accounts paint him as a sly jokester who never missed an opportunity to twist a story for his own gain. He was said to be skilled at fiddling, both musically with the instrument and metaphorically, as in fiddling around with people's trust. John D. Rockefeller later recalled that his father taught him certain negotiation tactics, though whether that was direct instruction or simply an imitation of William's cunning ways is unclear. According to a few local legends cited in small community newspapers, the kind you find in upstate New York historical archives, William had a gift for bartering that bordered on the magical. Folks claimed he could arrive in a town with almost nothing, spin a yarn, trade and barter with half the locals, and depart with a horse and some money in his pocket. These little stories, while sometimes suspect as factual accounts, underscore the mythic status he developed among those who knew him, or at least knew of him. Yet the cheerful, roguish facade had a darker layer. The allegations of sexual misconduct, including rape, can't be dismissed outright, although definitive proof remains elusive. In the 19th century, especially in rural communities, accusations of rape could cause significant outrage, but convictions often hinged on local politics, personal feuds, or the victim's status in the community. If William indeed faced a formal indictment, some authors mention a bounty or reward posted for his capture, he might have used his cunning, or perhaps bribery, to avoid prosecution. These unresolved accusations fed William's reputation as Devil Bill, a moniker he seemed to wear with a perverse kind of pride. As John D. Rockefeller grew older and began to shape the empire that would become Standard Oil, he made conscious efforts to rewrite his family's narrative. According to Chernow's Titan and other biographical explorations, John D. was deeply embarrassed by his father's unscrupulous ways. He rarely spoke publicly about William, and if pressed, would offer vague statements or change the subject. While John D. built a public image of devout Baptist piety and business discipline, the contrast with his father's chaotic morality could not have been starker. The gospel of wealth that John D. later embraced, rooted partly in the idea that godliness demands a sense of responsibility, owed nothing to Devil Bill's example, or so John D. claimed. However, historians note that John D. might have absorbed Devil Bill's relentless cunning in negotiation and deal-making, traits that served him well in dominating the oil industry. Indeed, some sources, including select articles in the Journal of American History, and a few blog analyses devoted to 19th century capitalism speculate that William's confidence tricks and manipulative style gave John D. both a cautionary template of what to avoid publicly and a private appreciation of psychological maneuvering. Even if John D. despised his father's immorality, he might still have recognized the pragmatic value in certain aspects of William's approach to human interaction, reading people, persuading them, and knowing when to walk away from a bad deal. Yet John D. apparently never credited his father with teaching him anything positive. Instead, he told more palatable anecdotes, how he and his siblings had to fend for themselves, how they learned thrift and industriousness from their deeply religious mother, and how he developed a strong work ethic that contrasted with his father's aimless wanderings. The family's reticence to speak of William's misdeeds also underscores a broader theme of how the Rockefellers cultivated their image. By the early 20th century, the name Rockefeller was already becoming synonymous with wealth and power. Newspapers loved to profile John D. Rockefeller Sr., especially as Standard Oil expanded. Whenever Devil Bill popped up in these stories as a footnote, someone might recall the time they'd been swindled or mention the rumors of bigamy. There was a risk. The new generation's reputation could be sullied. Thus, it's said that John D. practiced a form of quiet crisis management long before modern public relations techniques were formalized. Rather than stage a confrontation or address the rumors head-on, he and his immediate family simply refused to speak about William, hoping the interest would die out. That approach largely worked. As time passed, John D.'s philanthropic achievements, founding the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation supporting medical research and public health initiatives, overshadowed the small-town gossip about his father's mischief. When journalists or local busybodies did try to dig up more details, the official stance from the Rockefeller camp was minimal. Some researchers from universities like Columbia and the University of Chicago mention that access to certain Rockefeller family papers, especially those dealing with William Avery Rockefeller, was restricted for decades. Whether that was a matter of personal privacy or a more deliberate effort to whitewash the past is open to speculation, but the secrecy further fueled the mysterious aura around Devil Bill. It's also critical to remember that a figure like William Avery Rockefeller, though exceptional in many ways, was not entirely out of place in 19th century America. The decades before and after the Civil War were full of itinerant salesmen and half-legal entrepreneurs. Some ended up founding legitimate businesses, others drifted into petty or serious crime. The West, if we can consider places like Ohio or parts of upstate New York Western in that era's imagination, was a place of experimentation where social structures were more fluid than in the older, established parts of the East Coast. William took advantage of that fluidity, slipping in and out of communities that had few tools to combat or even record his scams. A wealth of blogs focusing on true crime of the 1800s have recounted the ways in which local authorities struggled to handle traveling criminals. Communication was slow. Wanted posters might not reach the next town until the suspect was long gone. Legal systems differed from one county to the next. Thus, individuals like William Avery Rockefeller could vanish into a new identity with comparative ease. In a sense, Devil Bill was a product of that broader environment, a cunning manipulator aware that social and technological conditions favored the bold. John D. Rockefeller's rise to prominence as the head of Standard Oil is often cited as the quintessential example of Gilded Age capitalism, an era marked by breathtaking expansions of industry alongside equally breathtaking abuses of power. Standard Oil became a household name not merely for its dominance in oil refining and distribution, but also for the tactics it employed to cement that dominance. At the height of its influence, the company controlled an estimated 90% of America's refining capacity, leveraging secret deals, predatory pricing, and strategic buyouts to lay claim to its near monopoly. Journalists, historians, and legal scholars have all pored over this story in excruciating detail, and the words Cleveland Massacre have come to symbolize one of the most blatant demonstrations of how far Standard Oil was willing to go to wipe out or absorb its rivals. It's helpful to begin with a broader context. Mid to late 19th century America was a bit like the Wild West of business. Railroads stretched across the country, fueling commerce and migration, but also providing ample opportunities for favoritism and hidden rebates. Few federal regulations existed to rein in aggressive corporate behavior. The Sherman Antitrust Act wouldn't be passed until 1890, and even then, it took years of legal wrangling before the act was used effectively against big trusts. In this environment, ambitious entrepreneurs like Rockefeller had free rein to innovate and to exploit the system. According to Ron Chernow's biography, Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr., Rockefeller possessed an almost preternatural understanding of business strategy, focusing meticulously on cost-cutting, consolidation, and control over both supply and distribution. The phrase Cleveland Massacre is somewhat dramatic but not entirely hyperbolic. It refers to a pivotal moment in 1872 when Standard Oil systematically took over or bankrupted a host of competing refineries in Cleveland, Ohio. At that time, Cleveland was a crucial hub for oil refining because of its proximity to both Pennsylvania's oil fields and major rail lines. While some historians note the seeds of Standard Oil's power had already been planted earlier, the events of 1872 showed just how ruthless and coordinated Rockefeller's plans could be. According to Ida Tarbell's groundbreaking expose, The History of the Standard Oil Company, originally published as a series of articles in McClure's magazine from 1902 to 1904, Standard Oil used secret transportation rebates and preferential deals with railroads to undercut its competitors. As Tarbell detailed, Rockefeller and his associates negotiated with the Lakeshore Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and others, securing special rates that were unavailable to smaller refineries. These hidden rebates allowed Standard Oil to ship its products at a fraction of the cost competitors paid. The result was a lethal squeeze on rival refiners' margins. Some simply couldn't cope. Those who refused to sell to Rockefeller were often driven into bankruptcy by sustained predatory pricing. At the same time, Standard Oil would approach struggling refineries with a buyout offer, promising continued employment for the owners or managers in some cases, on the condition that they sell out quietly. Historians like Alan Nevins and Chernow note that many businessmen accepted Rockefeller's terms rather than face imminent ruin. The upshot? By the end of this so-called Cleveland Massacre, Standard Oil emerged stronger than ever, having effectively wiped the board of local competition in a matter of months. Local newspapers, such as the Cleveland Herald, reported on the suspiciously rapid changes in refinery ownership. However, the mainstream press of the era didn't initially grasp the full scope or the clandestine nature of the railroad rebate system. Only later, when investigative journalists like Tarbell dug deeper, did the public start to see the bigger picture, a carefully orchestrated scheme that went far beyond ordinary commerce. Ida Tarbell's exposés are often credited with galvanizing public opinion against Standard Oil. Her father had been involved in the oil business and had personally felt the sting of Rockefeller's tactics, adding a personal edge to her investigation. Her serialized articles, later collected into the history of the Standard Oil Company, peeled back the layers of secrecy surrounding the trust. Newspapers like the New York World and the Nation amplified Tarbell's findings, turning what might have been a local scandal into a national outcry. Tarbell didn't just castigate Rockefeller for using shady deals. She meticulously documented how Standard Oil coerced railroads into giving it better rates and refunds on those rates than any competitor. She also showed that Standard Oil resorted to intimidation of smaller refiners, economic espionage, and sweetheart arrangements to ensure they stayed at the top of the oil heap. She provided names, dates, contracts, and testimonies, weaving a portrait of a trust that considered virtually no method too severe to achieve total market dominance. Of course, Rockefeller and his allies fought back with a robust public relations campaign. He rarely responded directly to Tarbell, preferring to stress the efficiency and stability that Standard Oil brought to the marketplace. Rockefeller's defenders, including some editorial boards friendly to big business, argued that Standard Oil was beneficial because it standardized prices and products and delivered a dependable supply of oil in an era of chaotic boom and bust cycles. Despite the controversy, Standard Oil's growth was phenomenal. By the 1880s, the company refined upwards of 80 to 90% of America's oil. It also branched out, owning pipelines, tanker cars, barrel-making facilities, and more, creating a vast vertical and horizontal integration that was nearly impossible for any challenger to replicate. This structure allowed Standard Oil to control not just how oil was refined, but how it was transported and sold. If you lived in a city that depended on Rockefeller's network, your local refiner likely had little to no choice but to align with Standard Oil or go under. Unsurprisingly, Americans became increasingly wary of such concentrated power. Even though the Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted in 1890, the government did not immediately move to break up Standard Oil. Part of the delay stemmed from the complexities of trust law. Standard Oil often restructured itself to stay ahead of legal challenges. For instance, in 1882, it formed the Standard Oil Trust, which centralized various state-based companies under a single group of trustees led by Rockefeller. Over time, as states like Ohio began to crack down on trust, Standard Oil reshuffled again into new corporate forms, making it harder for regulators to corner it. Eventually, federal authorities and public opinion reached a breaking point. A spate of legal actions catalyzed by investigations from the U.S. Bureau of Corporations culminated in a landmark case, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey v. United States, 1911. By this point, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration had already shown an appetite for trust busting, and public support had swung decisively behind the idea that monopolies were detrimental to free enterprise. The Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil's near absolute dominance was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The decision ordered Standard Oil to be divided into 34 separate companies, each of which was expected to operate independently. These baby standards included entities that would eventually become household names like Exxon, originally Standard Oil of New Jersey, Mobil, Standard Oil of New York, Chevron, Standard Oil of California, Amoco, Standard Oil of Indiana, and more. Additional splits led to smaller regional successors. Yet the irony widely discussed in business and financial publications is that John D. Rockefeller's personal net worth actually grew in the aftermath. He held shares in each of the baby standards, and when their collective stock prices soared post-breakup, His overall wealth increased. Financial newspapers like the Wall Street Journal chronicled how these spin-offs quickly flourished, maintaining substantial refining and marketing operations across the U.S. and, eventually, the globe. While the breakup did foster some degree of competition, many of the successor companies remained extremely profitable. Over time, consolidation in the oil industry continued, with some of the baby standards merging. Exxon and Mobil famously reunited in 1999 to form ExxonMobil, one of the largest publicly traded oil companies in the world. The colossal scale of today's oil multinationals can be traced back directly to those original pieces of the Standard Oil empire. The entire saga raises an intriguing question. If the breakup ultimately enriched Rockefeller further, can we truly say Standard Oil lost? From a purely economic standpoint, the trust was dismantled, but its founder didn't suffer a crippling setback. In fact, as documented in various business history case studies, many members of the Rockefeller family remained heavily invested in the spin-off companies, thereby continuing to exert influence on the global oil market. John D. Rockefeller famously took a philosophical stance on the Supreme Court decision, emphasizing that competition among the newly formed companies might even spur greater innovation and profitability. Meanwhile, the public's perception of Rockefeller was slow to improve. Ida Tarbell's exposés had left a deep mark, and the notion that Standard Oil had bullied smaller businesses and manipulated the system for decades didn't wash away overnight. However, Rockefeller's ever-expanding philanthropic efforts, coupled with the fact that he had largely stepped away from daily operations by the time of the 1911 breakup, helped mitigate some of the hostility. By the mid-1910s, the Rockefellers were increasingly seen as philanthropic benefactors rather than purely rapacious robber barons, though critics never ceased to remind anyone who would listen about the tactics that built their fortune. Historically, the Standard Oil breakup stands as a milestone in U.S. regulatory history. It was one of the first major implementations of the Sherman Antitrust Act that led to a genuine dismantling of a massive trust, setting a precedent for tackling other monopolies, including American tobacco, also broken up in 1911. The outcome of the case encouraged future legislation like the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, and the Federal Trade Commission Act, 1914, both of which refined and strengthened the government's ability to regulate big business. Legal scholars note that the rule of reason doctrine applied by the Supreme Court in the Standard Oil case shaped subsequent antitrust decisions, affirming that not all large-scale enterprises were inherently illegal, only those that unreasonably stifled competition. Thus, Standard Oil's story reverberates far beyond the company itself. It ushered in a new era of questioning how large corporations should be allowed to get, and whether unrestrained capitalism would smother the very competition it relies on. The Cleveland Massacre became a cautionary tale taught in American history and economic textbooks, illustrating just how quickly cutthroat strategies can decimate an entire sector. Meanwhile, Tarbell's work laid the groundwork for modern investigative journalism, proving that dogged research and well-presented facts could affect real change in national policy. Despite the breakup, Standard Oil's offspring remain profoundly significant in modern energy markets. ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, through various mergers with former Standard companies, and others are direct descendants. These firms rank among the largest energy corporations on the planet, influencing global oil prices, shaping environmental debates, and driving technological advances in drilling and refining. When you see an ExxonMobil or Chevron gas station, you're witnessing the legacy of John D. Rockefeller's once monolithic empire, albeit in fragmented form. Financial historians also point to how the success of these successor firms continued to bolster the Rockefeller family's wealth for generations. Dynasty trusts and careful estate planning allowed the Rockefellers to maintain a share in many of the spin-off companies, helping to preserve the family's fortune well into the 21st century. According to estimates in reputable business magazines like Forbes, the collective wealth of the extended Rockefeller lineage remains substantial, though nowhere near the top of today's ultra-billionaires. Nonetheless, the foundation laid in the Gilded Age via Standard Oil still underpins much of their philanthropic endeavors, political involvement, and cultural influence. The events surrounding the Ludlow Massacre in 1914 form one of the darkest chapters in the Rockefeller family's history, underscoring both the brutal realities of early 20th century labor strife and the public relations crisis that followed for one of the nation's most powerful industrial dynasties. On April 20th of that year, violence erupted at a tent colony of striking coal miners near Ludlow, Colorado, an incident that became infamous for the deaths of around 60 people, including women and children. These miners had been employed by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a major enterprise in the Rockefeller industrial portfolio. The bloodshed sparked widespread outrage, with newspapers like the New York Times, the Denver Post, and others disseminating graphic reports of the chaos, amplifying national condemnation of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s stance against unionization. While the family had already begun various philanthropic efforts prior to Ludlow, the intensity of the backlash solidified public suspicion that many of their subsequent charitable gestures were calculated damage control. To understand how such a tragedy could unfold, we must turn to the labor conditions prevalent in the mines of Colorado during the early 1900s. According to data compiled by the United Mine Workers, UMW, and corroborated by periodicals of the era, the coal miners and their families in places like southern Colorado lived in company towns where nearly every aspect of their daily existence, housing, stores, schooling, was under the control of CF&I and similar corporations. Safety standards in the mines were notoriously lax, wages were precarious, and miners effectively had little voice in shaping their working conditions. Early 20th century America saw major labor unrest. Workers across industries were pressing for better pay, safer environments, and the right to organize. CF&I, whose principal shareholder was John D. Rockefeller Jr. by this point, stood vehemently against unions, reflecting the broader anti-union stance that many industrial magnates held. The conflict reached a boiling point when workers in CF&I's mines, along with miners employed by other companies, walked off the job in September 1913 under the banner of the United Mine Workers of America. They demanded such basics as an 8-hour workday, better wages, and recognition of their right to unionize. After being evicted from company-owned housing, many striking families set up tent colonies on public land. One of the largest sprang up near Ludlow. The Denver Post and other local newspapers covered the tense standoff in detail, describing armed guards, often hired by CF&I or other mining interests, circulating around these camps. Governor Elias M. Ammons eventually sent the Colorado National Guard to maintain order, though historically, critics argued that the Guard often sided with the interests of the mine owners. On April 20th, 1914, the simmering tension at Ludlow escalated into open conflict. The Guard attacked the tent colony, culminating in a day-long gun battle. The immediate death toll is still a matter of some debate. Historical accounts vary, but it's generally accepted that around 20 people were killed that day. including 2 women and at least 11 children who suffocated or were burned to death when the miners' tents were torched. In the days that followed, retaliatory violence by enraged miners spread up and down the coal fields of Colorado, leading to further deaths. Over the course of what's sometimes referred to as the Colorado Coalfield War, the casualty count climbed closer to 60, though exact figures remain contested. The images and stories sent to national media outlets, children's bodies discovered in cellars beneath charred tents, rattled public sensibilities. Almost overnight, Ludlow became a rallying cry for labor activists and progressive reformers. Mother Jones, known as the Miners' Angel, toured the country advocating for the rights of the Ludlow survivors and castigating the Rockefellers in fiery speeches. The American public was incensed that a wealthy family, symbolizing the pinnacle of American capitalism, could be even tangentially connected to such brutality. Testimony before the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations placed John D. Rockefeller, Jr. in the hot seat. According to transcripts preserved by the Library of Congress, he maintained his opposition to the Union, but expressed regret for the violence, claiming he was largely unaware of the harsh methods used by on-the-ground management and by local authorities. Nonetheless, reporters from the New York Times and The Nation magazine accused him of moral complicity, emphasizing how CF&I's entrenched anti-union philosophy made the confrontation all but inevitable. In terms of reputation, the fallout was immense. Editorial cartoons in publications like The Masses and other socialist-leaning or progressive outlets depicted the Rockefeller name as drenched in the blood of the miners' families. These sensational images weren't restricted to fringe magazines. They found their way into mainstream discourse as well, shifting public sentiment. While the Rockefellers had been unpopular in many labor circles for years due to Standard Oil's monopolistic history, Ludlow took that antipathy to a whole new level. At the same time, it's important to note that John D. Rockefeller Jr. was not his father. John D. Rockefeller Sr., who had personally orchestrated Standard Oil's early expansion. The younger Rockefeller was known for a more progressive, if still paternalistic, approach to labor and social issues, at least relative to other barons of the era. He had even established a sociological department in CF&I to investigate living and working conditions and propose improvements. But critics argued such measures were largely cosmetic and never addressed union recognition, the miners' key demand. In the aftermath of the massacre, Rockefeller Jr. realized that a dramatic change in public relations was needed. According to Ivy Lee, often considered one of the founding fathers of modern public relations, Rockefeller Jr. hired him to shape a new, more sympathetic public image for the family. This shift included direct communication with the press and carefully orchestrated visits to the mining communities in Colorado. One much publicized gesture was Rockefeller Jr.'s journey to the coalfields in 1915, during which he spent time in miners' homes, listened to their grievances, and participated in prayer sessions. Photographers and journalists were invited along, ensuring that these acts of apparent empathy reached a broad audience. Yet a broader debate has persisted. Were the Rockefellers' subsequent philanthropic ventures primarily motivated by sincere moral and religious convictions, or were they cynical damage control efforts? The truth, as many historians have pointed out, is likely complicated. John D. Rockefeller Sr., for instance, had been donating large sums of money to causes such as education and medical research well before 1914. Recall his early involvement in founding the University of Chicago, as well as his massive contributions to spell out public health campaigns against diseases like hookworm. By the time of the Ludlow Massacre, the Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, was already formulating major interventions in global health and scientific study. Still, The timing of an increased flow of funds towards social and community-oriented projects in Colorado after 1914 feeds the perception that part of it was indeed reputational triage. One of the most notable philanthropic expansions post-Ludlow was the support for community centers, model villages, and improved worker housing, especially in places where the Rockefellers had industrial interests. CF&I's Employee Representation Plan, sometimes called the Rockefeller Plan, was also introduced, billed by Rockefeller Jr. as a way for workers to have a voice without formally organizing into an outside union. While it did provide a channel for grievances and some incremental improvements, labor historians have pointed out that this system essentially bypassed the traditional union model, leaving ultimate control in the hands of company-appointed representatives. Alongside these efforts on the ground, the Rockefeller Foundation increased its philanthropic footprint in a variety of fields. Public health campaigns to combat hookworm in the American South and malaria in parts of Latin America, funding for medical schools, and even cultural patronage in the arts. Newspapers like the Christian Science Monitor and the Washington Post periodically highlighted these philanthropic achievements, sometimes contrasting them with the earlier horror of Ludlow in backhanded references. Over time, the synergy between the Rockefeller name and benevolence grew stronger, albeit with a lingering undercurrent of skepticism in union and socialist circles. From a broader perspective, the Ludlow Massacre was a catalyst in America's evolving labor relations. Several years later, legislation such as the Colorado Industrial Plan tried to reconcile some of the tensions. On a national scale, the wave of public sentiment that followed Ludlow contributed to the eventual shift in government attitudes toward labor, culminating in the reforms of the New Deal era under Franklin D. Roosevelt. Historians at the University of Colorado have suggested that the shock and outrage over Ludlow helped create momentum for legislative changes that recognized workers' rights to organize, though it would still be decades before fully robust labor protections were enshrined in federal law. Interestingly, while the Rockefellers never publicly stated that their philanthropic undertakings were a direct response to Ludlow, the correlation was hard for contemporaries to ignore. Many claimed that the ramp-up of charitable deeds in the mid-1910s was a conscious attempt to clean the family name. They found God in Ludlow, read one biting commentary in a local labor newspaper. Yet defenders argued that individuals like John D. Rockefeller Jr., guided by his Baptist upbringing, had always believed that vast wealth carried moral obligations. His father, John D. Rockefeller Sr., was famously quoted as saying, "God gave me my money," a statement widely interpreted to mean that the family's fortune was entrusted to them for higher purposes, a premise they sought to reflect in the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation and other charitable organizations. Over time, the philanthropic arm of the family overshadowed much of the lingering public memory of Ludlow, at least in mainstream discourse. By mid-20th century, references to the massacre were more common among labor historians, leftist activists, or local Coloradans who held annual memorial services. Efforts by the United Mine Workers to preserve the site led to the establishment of the Ludlow Tent Colony National Historic Landmark, maintained by the Union and recognized by the National Park Service. Indeed, visiting the Ludlow site today provides an opportunity to see a simple memorial featuring a statue dedicated to the fallen miners and their families. Historical markers explain the background of the conflict, ensuring that the events of 1914 aren't entirely lost to time. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller's sudden death on January 26, 1979, initially seemed straightforward, but it rapidly evolved into a scandal that disrupted the Rockefeller family's carefully managed public image and sparked a wave of press scrutiny reminiscent of tabloid intrigue. Major outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, first reported that he died of a heart attack at his Midtown office on West 54th Street. But these early stories soon clashed with reports from paramedics, local witnesses, and the tabloids, the New York Post and the Daily News most prominently, that he had actually collapsed at a private townhouse in the company of a 25-year-old aide named Megan Marshak. While the official cause of death, cardiac arrest, was never challenged, the location of his final moments and the potential romantic overtones involving Marshak ignited public fascination and cast a revealing light on the private vulnerabilities of one of America's most distinguished political dynasties. Nelson Rockefeller was no stranger to media attention. He had governed New York State for 4 consecutive terms, 1959 to 1973, championing education, infrastructure, environmental conservation, and arts funding. Political commentators of the era viewed him as a standard bearer of moderate republicanism, one who had aspirations for the presidency, as evidenced by his bids in 1964 and 1968, and later accepted the vice presidency under President Gerald Ford, 1974 to 1977. Newspapers often praised his bold initiatives, such as the modernization of the State University of New York system and his enthusiastic patronage of modern art. Even after stepping down from public office, he remained in the spotlight through philanthropic endeavors and ties to cultural institutions like the Museum of Modern Art, an entity his mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, had co-founded decades earlier. Journalists generally portrayed him as a polished, proactive figure who could balance worldly sophistication with an enduring commitment to public service. When word broke that he had died unexpectedly, initial press releases from family spokesman Hugh Morrow described him working late into the night at his office, poring over papers related to his art collection. Yet within days, the story unraveled. Local first responders told reporters that they never arrived at Rockefeller's office at all, instead rushing to a townhouse in the East 50s. Some neighbors in that area, interviewed by the Daily News, recalled hearing a commotion or noticing unfamiliar activity late that evening. Those details conflicted with the family's early statements, fueling speculation that the Rockefellers were trying to obscure less than flattering circumstances. Central to the scandal was Megan Marshak, a young aide whose exact role in Rockefeller's life had been only vaguely described in official statements. Some accounts characterized her as a personal assistant or receptionist, while others suggested she managed parts of his philanthropic or art-related projects. According to a 1979 article in the New York Post, Marshak had previously dabbled in journalism, holding brief stints at local TV or radio stations before securing a position in Rockefeller's circle. An Associated Press piece from the same period mentioned that she was known for her quick intelligence and focus on current affairs, but few concrete details surfaced about how she transitioned from media work to such an intimate professional relationship with the former vice president. What truly propelled the story into the national spotlight was the possibility of a romantic liaison between the 70-year-old Rockefeller and his 25-year-old aide. Tabloids latched onto rumors that Marshak either delayed calling emergency services or placed a frantic phone call only after summoning another friend to help her. The timing and sequence of calls remain murky, while the New York Times later tried to reconstruct the incident from official logs. It found that exact timestamps were either unavailable or conflicting. Neighbors gave contradictory accounts. Some said they heard an ambulance siren quickly after the commotion. Others claimed there was a notable delay. Adding to the intrigue, anonymous sources speculated in the New York Post that Marshak may have hastily hidden personal belongings or documents before paramedics arrived, though none of these rumors were ever definitively substantiated. Amid the swirling conjecture, Marshak herself withdrew from view. The few attempts by established outlets, like the Washington Post, to contact her resulted in no comment or politely declined interviews. A short-lived rumor circulated that she had received a discreet payout from the Rockefeller estate, a claim repeated in various tabloids but never confirmed by any of the family's official representatives. A People magazine piece at the time profiled Marshak's background in more depth, referencing statements from acquaintances who described her as driven, politically curious, and eager to work alongside high-profile figures. Yet no one could verify exactly what had transpired on that final night. Rockefeller's family and spokesman Hugh Morrow faced intense criticism for their shifting accounts. In the first days after his death, Morrow told the Washington Post that Rockefeller had died at his desk, echoing the earliest official statements. But as reporters uncovered the townhouse address, Morrow walked back some claims, citing confusion during those initial hours. Critics argued that the family was attempting a cover-up to preserve Rockefeller's sterling public persona. Supporters countered that shock and emotional distress likely explained the contradictory statements. Still, the incongruous timeline drew comparisons to other political scandals, marking one of the earliest instances in the post-Watergate era where a personal crisis of a high-profile individual exploded into a media feeding frenzy. While the scandal revolved around a single event, it intersected with broader discussions about Rockefeller's legacy. Until then, the controversies most often associated with him concerned policy decisions, his expansion of New York's drug laws, his budgetary priorities, or his handling of the Attica prison uprising in 1971. Those debates, though serious, were largely political and abstract. By contrast, the townhouse revelation humanized him in a way few had previously imagined, implying that behind the polished facade lay complexities and vulnerabilities akin to any public figure. That the name Rockefeller, long associated with the pinnacle of wealth, decorum, and philanthropic generosity, could be splashed across tabloids for a potential affair resonated powerfully. For some observers, it signaled a shift in American journalism, as the private failings of a political giant were now fair game for relentless public scrutiny. Biographies of Nelson Rockefeller published after 1979, including ones by Joseph E. Persico and other noted writers, consistently devote attention to this episode. They discuss his achievements, such as modernizing state institutions and championing the arts, and then contend with the abrupt finale that overshadowed the measured tributes expected of a statesman. Even among political rivals, there was a sense of shock that someone so apparently controlled and image-conscious could die in a manner that invited lurid speculation. In behind-the-scenes interviews quoted in magazines like Time, close friends revealed that Rockefeller's personal life became more private after he remarried in 1963 to Margaretta Happy Fittler. Yet they also acknowledged that he was sociable, fond of artistic gatherings, and often surrounded by young advisors eager to gain experience in political or cultural spheres. Some historians argue that the public's fascination with Rockefeller's final hours laid groundwork for the media's increasing willingness to investigate the personal affairs of politicians. Journalists and editors who once might have shown deference or exercised self-restraint felt emboldened to pursue every angle of the story, especially since the Rockefellers' evasive handling of the news seemed, to critics, to confirm there was more to uncover. By the 1980s, stories about the personal lives of politicians became common, an evolution partly traced back to the unsettling mixture of confusion, rumor, and half-truths that attended Rockefeller's death. Gradually, the sensational aspects of the incident receded in public memory. Later generations, reading about Nelson Rockefeller's 4 terms as governor or his tenure as vice president, might find only a brief mention of his last night. Still, in more expansive accounts of the Rockefeller dynasty, the townhouse scandal remains a reminder that even an illustrious family, lauded for its philanthropic foundations, architectural achievements like Rockefeller Center, and powerful roles in finance, can be blindsided by a personal crisis that no amount of wealth or institutional influence can fully contain. Historians looking back see it as both a dramatic coda to Rockefeller's storied life and an early sign of how the modern press would no longer politely overlook the intimate details of a public figure's private world. In the end, despite the rumors and the family's attempts to control the narrative, the precise sequence of events that night remains obscure. What is clear is that Nelson Rockefeller, a man once renowned for his political acumen, grand ambitions, and significant contributions to American public life, left behind a moment of chaos that captured the nation's attention and briefly turned an emblem of status and power into a figure of tabloid speculation. Over time, the focus returned to his legacy in government and the arts, yet references to that final evening have never entirely disappeared, serving as a lingering footnote to a career and a family history otherwise dominated by monumental achievements and carefully burnished prestige. Michael Clark Rockefeller's disappearance in November 1961 remains one of the most haunting and enduring mysteries tied to the Rockefeller family name. At just 23 years old, Michael was the son of then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and part of an anthropological research team studying the Asmat people of southwest New Guinea, now part of Indonesia's Papua province. Accounts from the time, including statements collected by Dutch colonial authorities and press coverage in outlets like the New York Times and Life magazine, paint the picture of a young man deeply interested in indigenous art and culture. He had traveled to New Guinea under the auspices of the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, aiming to document and collect Asmat carvings, elaborately carved wooden shields, drums, and ancestor poles that he hoped might eventually find a home in American museums. The ill-fated expedition took a dramatic turn on November 17, 1961. While Michael was crossing the mouth of a river near the Arafura Sea in a small makeshift catamaran with Dutch anthropologist René Wassing, the vessel unexpectedly capsized. The exact cause remains unclear. Some blamed sudden gusts of wind, others pointed to strong tidal currents. Although both men clung to the overturned craft for several hours, Michael ultimately decided to swim to shore in search of help. According to Wassing's later testimony to the Dutch authorities, Michael's last words were along the lines of, "I think I can make it," before he slipped into the water, presumably aiming for the faint outline of land on the horizon. The distance to shore was estimated to be anywhere from 10 to 12 miles. When news reached local officials in Morocco and Jayapura, major administrative centers in the region, the Dutch colonial government launched an exhaustive search that included planes, helicopters, and boats combing the coastline and nearby rivers. Nelson Rockefeller quickly arranged for additional private search parties, and the U.S. government, alerted to the disappearance of a prominent American, reportedly provided resources. Marine patrols, tribal guides, and professional divers scoured the estuaries, looking for any sign of Michael or a body. Despite this unprecedented effort, no trace of him was found. Multiple newspaper reports from late 1961 and early 1962 indicated that authorities believed he had almost certainly drowned. Time magazine's coverage at the time echoed this conclusion, underscoring the treacherous conditions of the region's waters. Although drowning remains the leading hypothesis, it did not take long for more sensational theories to emerge. The Asmat region, known for complex rituals and a reputation for headhunting in earlier decades and historically occasional cannibalistic practices, became the focal point of rumors that Michael had made it ashore only to be killed by local tribespeople. Initially, such suggestions were dismissed by Dutch officials, who maintained that any historical cannibalism among the Asmat had largely subsided under colonial oversight. Yet decades later, the possibility that Michael fell victim to violence or ritualistic practices resurfaced, especially with the publication of Carl Hoffman's book Savage Harvest, A Tale of Cannibals, Colonialism, and Michael Rockefeller's tragic quest in 2014. Hoffman drew on interviews with Asmat elders, archival Dutch records, and secondhand accounts of oral tradition suggesting that a mysterious outsider did reach shore around that time. Some Asmat informants, quoted anonymously, implied that locals had killed this outsider as retribution for earlier clashes with colonial forces. Hoffman's research gained attention from major news outlets like The Guardian and NPR, reinvigorating the debate over whether the death of Michael Rockefeller could have been an instance of retributive violence in a region with a fraught colonial history. Hoffman also pointed to the complex interplay of tribal warfare, Dutch pacification efforts, and local spiritual beliefs that might, under extremely rare circumstances, have led to the killing of an outsider. Yet even Savage Harvest does not provide ironclad proof. It relies on rumor, hearsay, and interpreted Asmat oral tradition. Academic anthropologists remain cautious, noting that while the Asmat have historical records of warfare and headhunting, the direct evidence tying them to Michael's disappearance is circumstantial at best. The Rockefeller family's response has been characteristically discreet. At the time of Michael's disappearance, Nelson Rockefeller and other family members were visibly distressed, flying to New Guinea and actively participating in the search. However, once it became clear that Michael was not going to be found, the official family stance shifted to quiet acceptance. Over the ensuing decades, none of the Rockefellers publicly endorsed or repudiated the cannibalism theory. They have instead honored Michael's memory by supporting museums and cultural institutions. His interest in indigenous art shaped some of the family's collecting and philanthropic efforts, particularly at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Primitive Art, later integrated into the Met's collections. Among close friends and colleagues, Michael is remembered as someone who possessed a genuine fascination with non-Western cultures and a willingness to immerse himself in the field, traits reflected in letters and journal entries that occasionally surface in academic circles. He had studied history and economics at Harvard, but his passion lay in ethnographic study and art curation. Blogs dedicated to anthropological lore sometimes highlight his disappearance as emblematic of the tension between young Western explorers, eager to document unspoiled tribal life, and the real dangers of stepping into lands with formidable terrain and limited medical or rescue infrastructure. Over the years, various explorers and journalists have proposed alternate fates. Some claim he assumed a new identity among the Asmat, a rumor reminiscent of colonial-era fantasies about Westerners going native. Others suggest that he may have made landfall only to die of exhaustion, illness, or injury soon thereafter. A few sensationalist tabloid stories in the 1960s insisted that Michael was being held captive by a remote tribe, but no credible evidence ever emerged to support such speculation. The complete absence of remains or personal effects, in a place where the environment can rapidly degrade or disperse evidence, ensured that no theory could be proven beyond doubt. Despite the notoriety of the story, the Rockefellers have been remarkably reserved. Their silence contrasts with other family crises that sometimes sparked public pronouncements. Observers point out that this personal tragedy, occurring thousands of miles from home and shrouded in cultural misunderstanding, touched on sensitive themes: colonial era interference in indigenous societies, the fervor of early anthropology expeditions, and the exoticized narratives of cannibal tribes. By refraining from endorsing any specific explanation, the family effectively left the door open to public speculation. Although the mystery persists, contemporary anthropology has evolved to examine how the Rockefeller disappearance reveals the complexities of cross-cultural contact. Articles in journals such as Cultural Anthropology and American Anthropologist occasionally reference the case as an example of the hazards faced by researchers in remote areas, as well as the ethical questions surrounding the collection of tribal artifacts. The Asmat region itself has also undergone changes. Better infrastructure, more regular contact with the Indonesian government, and an influx of missionaries, traders, and aid organizations mean it is no longer the isolated frontier it once was. Even so, local oral histories remain a vital repository of information. Some individuals still relate stories that could or could not refer to the fate of Michael Rockefeller, though language barriers and cultural nuances make verification elusive. Carl Hoffman's Savage Harvest brought the saga back into the limelight, sparking op-eds in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that debated not just the likelihood of cannibalism, but the broader responsibility of Western travelers in indigenous lands. Meanwhile, television documentaries and internet forums continue to revisit the case, lured by the enduring intrigue of a wealthy American heir stepping into a world so distant from his own, only to vanish without a trace. Conspiracy theories surrounding the Rockefeller name have circulated for more than a century, often gaining momentum during eras of social upheaval or rapid economic change. One persistent theme asserts that the family orchestrates global events through an interlocking network of financial institutions and philanthropic foundations, epitomized by David Rockefeller's longtime leadership at Chase Manhattan, which later merged into J.P. Morgan Chase, and the far-reaching activities of the Rockefeller Foundation. Critics online, particularly on forums and social media platforms, once known as Twitter and now rebranded as X, have alleged everything from secret manipulation of central banks, e.g. the Federal Reserve, to masterminding world conflicts for profit. David Rockefeller's involvement in forming the Trilateral Commission in 1973 and his connections to the Council on Foreign Relations are frequently cited in these narratives as proof of a clandestine effort to consolidate power. Critics latch onto records of high-level meetings and white papers, suggesting that these gatherings or publications serve as camouflage for global control. Reputable historians and mainstream news outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, generally view such claims as overblown, noting that while David Rockefeller and other family members indeed held influential positions, there is little evidence to support the notion of a hidden, all-encompassing plot. The Rockefeller Foundation's philanthropic record, encompassing public health initiatives, agricultural development in the global south and funding of medical research has similarly fueled suspicions that the family orchestrates public health policy. Assertions that they control vaccine distribution or engineer pandemics through entities like the World Health Organization appear on conspiracy-oriented blogs but lack credible substantiation. Journalists who have researched these theories, for instance, investigative pieces in The Atlantic and thorough analyses on sites like Snopes, point out that the foundation typically works in partnership with governments, universities, and NGOs, which significantly dilutes the likelihood of a single family unilaterally shaping the global health agenda. Even so, there is no denying that the Rockefellers, by virtue of a fortune built initially on Standard Oil and diversified over generations through dynasty trusts, continue to wield substantial soft power. They sit on boards, fund think tanks, and convene high-level conferences where discussions can influence policy directions, especially on issues related to international development, climate change, and economic reform. At times, official reports and meeting minutes made available by organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations reveal that Rockefeller family members or their surrogates played a part in framing policy debates. Skeptics point to those records as evidence of smoke-filled rooms, yet scholars of political science argue that top-level networking is standard in elite circles and does not automatically equate to secret control of world affairs. The notion that one wealthy clan precisely pulls the strings behind major wars or orchestrates specific legislation glosses over the messy reality of geopolitical maneuvering and the variety of competing interests worldwide. Financial historians from institutions like Harvard Business School and London School of Economics emphasize that while the Rockefellers' economic footprint has historically been vast, it has also been subject to market forces and regulatory checks. Following the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, the family diversified but did not monopolize new industries outright. Their role in U.S. finance, heightened during David Rockefeller's tenure at Chase, was significant, yet it coexisted with powerful rival banks, corporate entities, and political factions that limited any single family dominance. In recent decades, popular conspiracy theories continue to mutate, particularly on digital platforms and social media. Repetitive tropes include the family's alleged sway over education curricula through philanthropic grants to universities or clandestine control of new technologies via venture investments. Websites with questionable editorial standards often cherry-pick quotes from David Rockefeller's memoir, misrepresenting or truncating statements about global governance to bolster claims of an overarching plan for a so-called New World Order. However, reputable fact-checking sites like PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, and Snopes systematically debunk these distortions, underscoring the importance of contextual reading. From a sociological perspective, the pervasiveness of Rockefeller-related conspiracy theories can be traced back to the family's enduring visibility, which began in the Gilded Age with John D. Rockefeller's staggering wealth and continues through philanthropic projects that shape communities worldwide. Experts in cultural studies and media note that such grand narratives about puppet masters simplify the complex interplay of corporate influence, government policy, and global economics. The Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, operates under a publicly available charter, files annual financial disclosures, and partners with numerous organizations, rendering a stealthy, unilateral master plan impractical. Despite the wide scope of these claims, the reality is far less cinematic. The family wields influence typical of any multi-generational dynasty with financial resources and global connections, But the idea of a singular, coordinated plot controlling wars, vaccine policies, and banking systems lacks tangible proof. Scholars who have reviewed primary source documents, such as board meeting minutes, philanthropic grants, and David Rockefeller's personal correspondence archived at institutions like the Rockefeller Archive Center, conclude that the Rockefellers are major players in various sectors. Yet the messy, decentralized nature of world affairs contradicts the premise that one family alone orchestrates geopolitics. The modern Rockefeller presence, therefore, illustrates the blurred line between legitimate elite influence and exaggerated conspiracy narratives. While their wealth and history undeniably garner them a seat at many tables, the myth of an all-powerful Rockefeller cabal ultimately remains an oversimplified portrayal of how global power structures actually function.